Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the host of the Van Jones Show, Van Jones, joined by Distinguished Senior Fellow at Demos, Heather McGhee, CEO of Starfish Media Group, Soledad O'Brien, filmmaker John Ridley, and President of The Color of Change, Rashad Robinson.
Hello. Thank you very much. Well, I'm still trying to process all of that incredible information. And we got that last panel. Give a round of applause. That was mind-blowing stuff. It's amazing to have like data to confirm what we all sense, fear, and know. But this is going to be a panel hopefully pushing toward what can we do about it? What can we do about it? Because the reason that we have those kind of outcomes is because people are swimming around in narratives and in stories. And I always like to say something that is obvious but isn't pointed out enough, which is that the earth is made of stone, but the world is made of stories. The earth is made of stone, but the world, society, is made of stories. And so everything that we think is true about what's beautiful, what's right, what's fair, what's not fair, what's appropriate, who should speak, all of that comes to us through stories. And it's different in different communities, lets you know the power of stories. And we have on this panel 4 people who have made a tremendous impact on the world, on society, on American politics and culture in a very unusual way. Not because they've registered the most voters, though many of them have done a lot of that. Not because they deployed the most capital, though many of them have done that as well. But because they told some of the most powerful, important stories and truths and have a wealth of experiences they want to share with us about how that works and what that's about. And so I want to welcome, I've got a chance to work with almost everybody here. I love you, I haven't worked with you yet. But it's time. And you ain't getting away from here either, I'll get your card. You know, Rashad Robinson is here, colorofchange.org, an organization that is probably, I would have to say at this point, the most effective online civil rights organization in the world. More than 1 million members now?
1.4.
1.4 million members with a whole string of victories behind them based on the stories that you tell. We have John Ridley, one of the great filmmakers of all time, certainly of our time here, who understands that most of us relate to each other through culture, not through one-on-one interactions, has been able to use that form and that medium. Soledad O'Brien, who is the reason I have a job at CNN. She gave me my shot. I'll give her a round of applause for that anyway. Some people are like, boo. What'd you do that for? But she gave me my first shot on CNN back in the day, and has been obviously a legendary presence both in the documentary world. She basically has invented what people now call docuseries, et cetera. She's here. And then Heather McGhee, who as the leader of Demos and now a new mom and an author of a forthcoming book about how racism costs everybody in America. She's going to prove that. And Heather McGhee is somebody who, from the micro interaction, this famous micro interaction with a guy named Gary, which she'll talk about, I'm sure, to moving public policy on some of the most important issues, has also used her words, use her stories to make a huge difference. So just give this a round of applause to this incredible panel that we've got. And I want to start with you, Rashad, because you know, you came into civil rights and just pissed everybody off because you had such a different approach to how to get things done. Part of it had to do with your background with GLAAD. Part of it had to do with your own kind of native genius. And you're now trying to bring a different approach to this discussion of poverty. And you've said something about poverty, that poverty is being seen as something often that is unfortunate. You don't see it as unfortunate, you see it as unjust. Explain to us what you're talking about. Yeah. You completely disrupted civil rights by going online and doing stuff nobody's seen before. What should we be doing different about poverty with that framework?
Well, great. Well, thank you. And your introduction is great. We should just like have you do this all the time. And thank you all for this opportunity, and Wes for bringing us all together and your team. You know, Color of Change was founded actually by Van and James Rucker after Hurricane Katrina, when black people were on their roofs begging for the government to do something and were literally left to die. And that big question, right, was not all the issues that people knew about, geographic segregation, generational poverty, the impacts of what has happened to so many different systems, but at the heart of it, no one was nervous about disappointing black people. The government wasn't nervous, corporations weren't nervous, media wasn't nervous. And when institutions are not nervous about disappointing your community, you can have all the research reports you want that sort of shows the disparities in very clear ways with great charts, and people will look at that research report and they will shake their head and keep moving. You can go into the courtroom, and if you don't have the power to implement the decisions, then you don't actually have results. Silicon Valley can make us all sorts of tools, but you can't code your way or nonprofit executive direct your way out of those type of problems. And so a lot of the work that we try to do at Color of Change is obviously translating energy in an individual moment into real activism, but it's also about the story that we tell and about how we direct that energy. And so far too often people see inequality, poverty, racism as unfortunate, almost like a car accident. And when I say people, I'm not talking about just the opponents of the things that we care about. I'm talking about our people in barbershops, in beauty salons. We'll talk about these issues like, what does the person who is suffering need to do, not what the sort of system needs to do to change. And oftentimes, our side will say to people, oh, it's structural. And we're right, it's structural. But if people believe that someone has done something wrong, to put themselves in the problem that they're in, and we answer that with structural, it's like apples to elephants for people. Because oftentimes we're afraid to actually talk about how poverty is manufactured. Who's winning and who's losing. And so because we stay at unfortunate to unjust, we get charity over structural changes. We get water bottles to Flint instead of actually cleaning up the pipes. We get cleaning up inner city schools instead of changing public education. We get people stopping at reentry instead of ending mass incarceration. And over this cycle can happen where we hear big problems, big numbers about how many people are in poverty 10 years ago, and we zoom forward and we have the same exact numbers 10 years later, even though we've all come together and had a lot of great conversations about the will to move forward. And so it is combining sort of the right set of stories with a willingness to actually hold those in power accountable and tell a story about how these systems have actually been manufactured, not asking the people who are suffering to change their behavior, but to think about how do we change the behavior of those who are winning. I'll end by saying that because of this story that we tell, and without actually telling a clear story of a villain, those who actually are causing the problems can fill in that story with immigrants, with black people, with women's progress. They can fill in the story because it actually is sort of a plausible story for people. And we're sort of left trying to explain to people a story that doesn't make sense to, you know, our 5-year-old and doesn't make sense to us either.
Welcome to the panel. Oh, I love this, brother. So I want to skip because now we're in the domain of power and policy and that kind of stuff, and that's also your domain, Heather. I mean, when you're on television, you're just arresting. You're able to talk about stuff that is incredibly difficult, incredibly policy sophisticated. You stay relatable. You make it meaningful to the audience. I've seen you had this thing with Gary, this white racist guy. I mean, I'm not calling him racist. He calls himself racist. This guy calls in and admits to her he got hypnotized by her on television. And he calls in and he admits, I am a racist. I'm like, what can I do? And she literally, like, it's like a suicide thing, like a suicide hotline. She like walks him off the racist roof. And it got like 1 million views. So I've seen you do that with an individual. I've seen you do that with a country. Talk to us about this relationship between racism, poverty, narrative.
Great. Thank you, Van.
Yeah.
I want to just say I'm a proud new board member of Color of Change. If you don't know about what they're doing to change the narrative between getting cops off the air for the first time.
The show cops.
Yeah, the show cops, not all the cops off the air. That's the long-term strategic plan. Please check them out. So this question, I think, is one of the most vexing for all of us who care to see a more equitable and fair society. How can we cut this knot that has linked the color of your skin to the station of your life for as long as this country has been around? And now, particularly, that so many people who are not people of color are struggling with unemployment and underemployment and the diseases of despair, can we finally, in this country that was founded on a belief in a hierarchy of human value, can we finally have some cross-racial solidarity in this country? That's the question, right? So I think we need to do a few things in terms of story. I think, frankly, this is a moment where, I ran for 4 years and was at, for 16, a policy organization whose job was to try to move that window so that what is necessary becomes what's possible. And we have seen that. We did that on credit card reform, on Wall Street reform. We did it on mainstreaming the idea of debt-free college into the public debate. And we are now in a moment where those big policy ideas, universal basic income, which I would have some tweaks to, but really big things like a housing guarantee, a jobs guarantee, a Green New Deal, they are in the mainstream public debate now. Now is the question about story. Now is the time for story to help propel those ideas into reality. So we did a huge research project at Demos about the relationship between race and class. And what we found was that no matter what your race, age, demographics, if you leaned sort of oppositional to most of the things that we care about in terms of solutions, you had a link in your mind between the issue of race, the role of government, and wealth that was very, very clear. What did I mean by that? One, you believe that people of color are kind of getting over in some way. That is linked to you believe that the wealthy got there because of their character, not just circumstances. And you believe the government is doing too much and should be smaller. 1, 2, 3, race, class, government. Now, that story that I just told is so pervasive in our media, in our, at our picnic tables. It is so pervasive. We have got to tell a different story that, just as Rashad was saying, recognizes that there has to be a different villain that's not the person of color, the immigrant, the poor family, that's not government. But we have to remember that those three ideas are linked. And so we have to replace it with the idea that we are all, no matter where we come from, we work hard and want what's best for our families. Everybody's nodding. People agree with that. And then you have to say, but right now, the people who are rigging the rules in order to line their own pockets are pointing the finger at black families, new immigrants, poor families, in order to distract us from what they're doing. And so you have to make that connection. You have to call out the racism. What we found is if you didn't mention race at all, right, this is the big debate. Can we mention race? Can we just talk about economics? If you didn't mention race at all, not only did you not get people of color to be nodding their heads and going along with what you were saying, but you didn't get white people either, because white people know that race is the issue. Race is all around. It's a constant. And so you have to talk about it, but then reframing and say, you know what? Someone's pointing the finger at people of color, and maybe we should think about what they're doing to us instead. And so I'll stop there, but we really do need to think about the way that, just as Rashad said, stories don't happen without a hero, a villain, a conflict, and some kind of accomplishment or victory in the end. So we can't tell our stories about laws and policies without saying, frankly, someone is doing this. And if we don't say who the someone is, and if we don't say it's the people who are, frankly, right now winning and using their money to rig the rules even further in their favor, then the narrative of who the someone is who's doing this is going to be the least of us, the people of color, immigrants, people without a lot of money.
Good. You know, a lot of the way that people come to know the world, now I guess with their smartphones, but up until now, through the news. Through the news. And Soledad, you were one of the first people who really tried to use the news and to use your platform at CNN in a different way with what we now call docuseries. I don't think that word even existed before you did Race in America, all the things that you did. What is the complicity that you see in terms of today's news media, and what are some of the things that you're doing and other things that are happening that you think can actually help us move in a better direction?
I'll give you some examples just from the last week or so. One was from last night. If anybody watched that horrible travesty called the Super Bowl, where Mike didn't really want the Patriots to win, but they did again. I'm not bitter. But there was an ad that I think the Washington Post put on about journalism. Did you guys see that ad? And I went to get PT on my bad knee this morning, and I said to my PT guy, who has his doctorate in physical therapy, and owns the business, and I said, so what did you think? And he said, you guys are so arrogant. That little, you're stuck up. He said, that ad was so stuck up. And I actually agreed with him when I saw that ad, right? I felt like it's all the beautiful, interesting, wide shots of the big story and the capital J, right? And not, we took a mic and we gave it to some people who were not being heard, which to me is the definition of good journalism, right? It was just, the last social justice, the shot that they had was the first one. And it was Dr. King. Everyone always goes back to Dr. King when they're thinking social, as if there are not other examples like today that we could dig out of somewhere. Right? It has to be like, remember Selma. It's always Selma. And that was the opening shot of the thing. And I actually completely agreed with him. Was like, this is not what I do. This video is very beautiful, but it's not what I do. I don't do that. I don't think I'm more important than people. The second example I would give, and not to pick on Chuck Todd, but they both involve him. Well, listen, I'm sure he's a nice guy. But talking to Tom Brokaw a week ago or so, right? And then today, or over the weekend, in an interview where he asked Sherrod Brown, do you believe in his heart that he's a racist? Sherrod Brown is obviously a presidential contender, said Donald Trump is a racist. And the pushback from the interviewer was, you really believe in his heart, right? As if somehow that's what is that? And Sherrod Brown, to his credit, said, I don't even know what that means. Like, what is that stupidity? Like, what is that? I don't know if you're creating policies that are racist and you say racist things. I mean, doesn't that count as racist? And so in both cases, when Tom Brokaw said a couple of things that were very disturbing and inaccurate, here he was on the platform to say something, right? That's the job of the moderator, to say, whoa, wow, well, people are telling you that? They don't want brown babies? What do you say to them? That's a really interesting, that's the start of your interview. Right. Like, holy cow, is this thing running? I'd like to get this. But it was sort of said, and everyone's like, yep, okay, people don't want brown babies. That mixed marriages, or whatever is the word that he used, people had a problem with that. Well, the data would show you that number's only increased dramatically. That Latinos, Hispanics, I think the word that he used, were not assimilating. Yeah. Well, data would tell you that the person who arrives, sure, they struggle to speak English. The next generation speaks English and Spanish. The third generation, the problem is they don't speak any Spanish. Right. So then the next generation, which would be my children, are in intensive Spanish classes because I don't speak Spanish. My mother is fluent in English and Spanish, and my abuelita said bye and hi. That were the two words that she knew, right? We are the classic art. But here's someone on a major network, speaking with authority, and you just want to jump through the TV and say, I need you to be the moderator of a better conversation. And that's where I'm really challenged. And I don't want to be, I love journalism. I don't want to be the person who harps on journalists. I love journalism. But somehow we've got to be able to have the voice. The reason you need people around the table is that someone can jump in and be like, excuse me, I need to hop in here. And we don't really have that now. And so you have a lot of, let's dig into the hearts of white supremacists. Let's really try to understand, if you had a Trump rally, for example, let's find the black person at the Trump rally, right? Like, there's always a sense of, how do we find this thing, as opposed to saying, what is the actual story here? What is the reality in the story? And how do we find people, and I agree with you, what is that narrative, and then undergirded with the data? Sure, looking at the history of redlining sounds like it would be a yawn. But the actual living story of redlining will break your heart. And then getting the news organizations to understand, it's not, does he have racism in his heart or not? It's, so what's been the policies that created the housing environment that we live in today, that black people's net worth is so much smaller, right? And no one seems to want to, at these higher levels, ask those questions, right? It's just, here's John Doe, black guy at a Trump rally, here's so-and-so. It's very thin. And that is what I've found very frustrating. In the show that I do, which is a syndicated show, it's called Matter of Fact. We do it for Hearst, and then it airs on all the networks. So officially, I am a big fan of Chuck Todd's, because his show comes on right before mine. And I don't mean to diss him personally. I'm gonna use the examples that are true examples. What we've tried to do is really hold ourselves accountable. So when people talk, our tagline is stories as diverse as our nation. And so people will say, well, how do you make sure you're diverse? I'm like, we count people. Why? Because we do. I'm not sure that naturally I would have a really good mix of people. So let's track it. You track everything that you want to know the true answer about, right? If it were refrigerators and I were GE, I'd write it down and track it. This is people and spokespeople. So we also make sure we're constantly pushing ourselves instead of doing a story about people dying from lack of insulin, which is insane in this country. You have someone on who this is their story, not the expert who says, listen, I have studied this issue for many years now, what we're finding. It's like, give me the person who will rip your heart out while she cries and says, I don't want my daughter to die, and I don't know what to do, and I'm spending my way through my savings. So I think it's really taking those stories that are emotional, undergirding them with data, and then really pushing everybody to say, it has to be deeper than what you're willing to go. The last time, right before I left CNN, I asked them, I said, we should do a story about poverty in America. And the answer was, nobody wants to see that. Nobody, and listen, and I get it, because part of it is, everyone thinks of it like hobo with a stick kind of thing, and they just didn't want to dig into the reality that it's people who look like all of us in this room who are getting by and just not telling you that they're sleeping in their car or they're trying to juggle medical bills that are about to sink them. Like, to me, that's the most emotional, horrific story. We've all been there, right? When you get a bill, and you can't pay it, you're like, oh my God, I don't know what to do. I mean, that is gut-wrenching. Right, but the idea was, well, it just doesn't, who wants that? Well, that's what that video should be. That video should be regular people who are telling their story. And I think more viewers would say, yes, people laughing and crying and hugging and cheering and whatever, and down this level. Not, I'm a journalist with a capital J, feel free to ask me any of your important questions about journalism, and they're very thoughtful and up here. Like, let's get in the mud and work on those stories.
Well, agree. Yeah. Well, we sure miss you. Anyway.
I'm not sure they do.
But we do. Speaking of getting down to it, and speaking of emotional authenticity, and speaking of the courage, I just hand the mic to you. It's one of the things I think it's so important in your role is that, unlike me, I get a few minutes, Heather gets a few minutes, Soledad gets a little bit longer, in terms of your role and your presence on television. You get a good email, but you get people's attention for a long time. And you are a custodian of people's heart, mind, and soul for 120 minutes. How do you approach your work in light of these challenges, in light of the fact that other media, there's some hope but not a lot? I mean, talk to us a little bit about the role of the filmmaker in this whole process of changing people's hearts and minds.
Well, first, again, just to echo everyone else, just thank you. I mean, it's one thing to sit and create in your home office. It's another thing to be around people who are actually going out and trying to make change, which is never easy. And it's obviously amazing to be around people who've done that and dedicated their lives to it. So thank you, and thanks to Wes for having me here. You know, in talking about the narrative, and I think everybody here has really hit it in terms of the emotion and being with people and being in their stories. Roger Ebert, who most people just call a film critic, but I think he was just a great film journalist. And he said, and I'm paraphrasing, but he said, you know, film at its best is just an apparatus for delivering empathy. And the power there, and there are two elements I want to talk about. I want about delivering empathy and talk about also sharing stories and sharing our stories. When I talk about our stories, I'm really talking about anybody who's outside of the prevailing culture. You know, women, people of color, people of orientations different than my own, stories that are not normally told or not told with the regularity. So first, delivering empathy and how important that is, because fortunately, I think for the most of us, not everybody, but the most of us, really difficult subjects, really difficult topics, you know, they're removed. Maybe it's a degree of separation, maybe it's 2 or 3 degrees of separation. You know, I mean, think about it. You know, how many crime shows there are on TV. We're fascinated by it. If crime really visited us at that rate, I think most of us, I mean, honestly, who could stand that? Who'd want to see that? But the reason it's interesting is because it doesn't visit us. The reason hospital shows are interesting is, you know, thank God, you know, we go in, we may get a checkup, we may have an issue with our knee, but it's not that kind of gut-wrenching show. So to be able to tell stories as I have about the Tuskegee Airmen, you know, 12 Years a Slave, American crime, I think people are fascinated by it because, thank God, it's not my story, but I can sit and I can look at it for a moment or for a couple of hours or for a few weeks and see something and feel something and being compelled in a way that I would not normally be. You know, we cross people every day who are in distress, who are in need, and we armor ourselves because we can't help everybody. We can't get everybody onto that life raft. So what do? Just as people, you know, we can't. But when we go home and we're sitting with our cup of coffee or a significant other for a moment and watching this and go, oh my God, I can't believe it. What a performance. And my heart is breaking. Yeah, probably the script was good, the direction was excellent, the acting was exceptional. But that story of something that is out there that is so close, you know, slavery is not that far away from us. You know, those kinds of distresses, those kinds of things. Talking about interracial marriage, 1967, Loving v. Virginia. So we walk around all day with people in different kind of couples, but it wasn't that long ago when it was illegal. So building these vehicles for delivering empathy, and delivering feeling and delivering emotion is so incredibly important, but marrying that within people who are telling their stories. You know, and I say this all the time, I don't think there should be a litmus test. I don't think with 2019 it's, well, you know, you're a white man, you should not be telling a story about black people. I don't think that's true. You know? But I do think that there are so many times when we don't necessarily have the opportunity to bring very particular perspectives and talk about very particular things and do it in a way that is so hyper-personalized that people walking away from it, whether you're black or white, just seeing something, you know, we're not monoliths. Not every black person is the same. Not every Hispanic person is the same. But there are elements of story that are so hyper-personalized and so unique that, yes, that I could tell a lot of very good stories, but that's a story I don't think I could particularly tell. And to make sure that those people who want to tell their stories have the opportunity to tell the stories that they can tell. The one other thing that I'll say, and one thing that to me that was probably one of the most exceptional spaces in my career, hopefully I'll have time to do more things, but should it end today, for 3 years I had the opportunity to work on a series called American Crime, which ran on ABC, which was remarkable because it was a show that was about very regular people. They were not glamorous. I mean, they were not glamorous to the point that, and this sounds like a little thing, but our actors didn't wear makeup. You know, we would send them out, you know, we'd send them out with appropriate makeup. If you're going to a meeting, that's fine. But, you know, whatever it is, but not that kind of glammed up, hey, we're dealing with poverty, or we're dealing with immigration, or we're dealing with very tough subject matter, sexual assault, but everybody's going to look great. You know, that's just... You know, so it sounds like a little thing, but, you know, face it, actors, you know, part of their job description is to be a little better than the rest of us, to look a little better, to be a little aspirational and all these things. So to say to actors, you know, you are paid to be better, but we want you to look as regular as possible. They went at it with just an intensity. And just as an aside, you know, for 3 years, 2 years she won the third year, but for Regina to walk away with Emmys for her performance, you know, in our first season she played a Muslim woman on television, and this was in 2015. If I'd known where we were going to go, where just being a Muslim on television is like a unicorn,
right,
we would have done more of it. But to work on a show for 3 years that, it was interesting, you talk about you got to have villains. Our point on that show was there was no villain other than the system. The system was the villain for 3 years. And everybody who went in it, either they went in it knowing that the system was against them, knowing that they had figured out a way to game the system, or finding out at the end that if you don't fix that system, if you don't change that system, it's just waiting to come after you. And that's the thing right now that I think we have to educate people on. You know, we should live in a nation, we should live in a world, we're just talking about our nation, where we are living in an equitable society. And you should want that because it's the right thing. But if you don't have the capacity to want it because it's right, you better have the capacity to want to change it before it bites you in the ass. Because that day is coming for everybody. So do it because it's the right thing to do, but do it because if you don't, that system, it's its own animal, its own beast. So changing the narrative, fixing the narrative is incredibly important, but making sure that we're providing space for people to tell their story, should they choose, is the most important thing.
Speaking of, why did you go after the cops show? And just respond to everything that you're hearing, because you've been more effective at getting corporate media to stop doing dumb stuff than anybody. You chased Glenn Beck off the air. You got Bill O'Reilly. You got the cop. I mean, listen. I know some of these people. And I don't glory in anybody's pain and suffering. But I do think that the airwaves might be a little bit better because of your work. Talk a little bit about what you're hearing.
So a lot of what we're trying to do is in the moment where where we have people's attention and they're watching these things on the air, how do we help combine the sort of understanding that people want to be engaged and they want something clear and strategic to do, with the idea that narrative means nothing if we don't have the infrastructure to move our stories and stop theirs. If we can create the best video and 10,000 people see it, and the NRA creates a video and 10 million people see it. And while our video might make us feel good, it doesn't actually move the story. And so we think a lot about sort of like the corridors of power, much the way you do. And I think a lot, and it's why as a next generation civil rights organization, we have an office in Hollywood, and we do a lot of work inside of Writers' Room to bring real people into Writers' Room. We have a huge report coming out in early March on all the crime procedures on television, and looking at sort of like what you would see over the course of a year and what you might see over the course of a week of any of the reruns that are constantly airing, with the deep understanding that we can write the best op-ed pieces. But if we're getting sort of a mix of racism and poverty porn every single night through these shows, that sort of use diversity as a tool to make us think the system is fair. One quick thing I can say without my researchers and my media team being mad that I'm sharing pieces about the research before it comes out is that all of the shows that we looked at over-indexed on black judges. Right? And it's a diversity thing. Like, they want to paint diversity, and that's a good thing, right? But what happens when a system is told by mostly rooms full of white writers, because out of like most of the vast majority had less than two black writers in their writers' room, through a stately black person's sort of voice, a 65, 70-year-old black person who has no backstory. What would have been for a black person to become a judge at 65 and 70? That's an interesting story in and of itself. But that person has no backstory, and they are then giving out justice to make us believe that what's happening inside of this courtroom, even while everything else that's happening in society is telling us it's fair. Medical shows is a different example. Always tell if there's a new innovation in cancer, one season, in a year, the next season on the medical shows, you see them mentioning this new innovation in cancer treatment or diabetes treatment. No innovations in crime, no innovations in how we think about poverty, no restorative justice. None of those things are really brought in at any type of scale. And so thinking about narrative in terms of how do we operationalize this idea that we have to move the narrative, what are the ways in which people receive information through news, through television, through the internet, and then how do we shift and move those decision makers to have to do something different, thereby people who are at home are receiving that story. That's how we move people from unfortunate to just, moving people from seeing it as unfortunate to unjust, because we're trying to actually reach people where they are and then trying to use the power of everyday people, their voice, holding corporations accountable, all of those tools to actually make sure that we're leveraging the narrative infrastructure to change the story that we see.
Van, may I just add one thing to that,
yes.
which is I think sometimes there are these amazing opportunities to create content and video that can really do the work that I think sometimes the media misses. So for example, when Wilbur Ross was sort of perplexed and said, listen, if you're struggling, just go get a loan. Like, you know, and what ended up happening though, the coverage was like, can you believe that Wilbur Ross is versus follow a person who's struggling, right? Again,
Yes.
like give the mic to someone else. And the video of being able to follow up, okay, what's your name, Jane? Go get a loan, Jane. Show me how you, who lives paycheck to paycheck, is gonna go get a loan. And I will
with your
tell
400 credit score.
Yeah.
Right, and you really, and then I think again, because you want the narrative to move people, it can't just be emotional, it also has to be educational and informative too. And so I sort of agree with what you say about the villain can't be a person because it's just so easy. Wilbur Ross, he's so out of it. He's not alone. The villain has to be a system that truly believes that somehow a loan will make up for this chaos in your paycheck. And let's underscore how so many people live, you know, hand to mouth essentially.
Rashad, you may see it differently. I want to hear from you, but Heather, get back in.
I want to talk about this villain piece because I think for those of us in the nonprofit sector, this can be a little bit uncomfortable. What do we mean by the villain? It's the person or the entity that is responsible and that benefits.
Yep.
Right? And so we're talking about poverty here. We're talking about mobility. Let's talk about the things that really trap people in poverty. Unaffordable housing. Who's responsible for unaffordable housing and who benefits? That is people, that is entities, that is corporations. Talk about healthcare costs and medical debt, right? Who is responsible and who profits? The criminal justice system. People are responsible and they profit, whether it's a for-profit system or the bail system, or it's a system of sort of white supremacy that allows, you know, entire groups of people to be, you know, seen as criminal, right? That is a sort of psychological benefit as well as a financial one. You can go through and tell the story of whatever your issue is, whether it's homelessness or medical debt or people, you know, struggling with, you know, prostitution and things that they have to do to make it work and to survive. And there will be someone who is responsible and who profits.
I worry though that that's almost too easy, right? Because it becomes, this is the person who profits. What's harder is, so what works, right? So here's the issue of homelessness, and here's what we know about it, and this is the system. But you know what worked? This thing over here is actually moving people out of homelessness. Let's put all, because otherwise at the end of those things, I want to throw myself out of the window, right? And I'm like, yes, this person's bad.
I agree there has to be a solution,
and
but
this guy's bad. But I think it has to be all wrapped up in one. Sorry.
It's the Van Jones show. Let me say something. Let me give, this is something that both Rashad and Heather thought through a great deal. Let me do the pushback, and you help me understand why you're so passionate about this. I might say, that seems to make me uncomfortable.
Sure.
If you're going to go around saying that you did something wrong, and you did something wrong, and you did something wrong, I might be in that group. Or my donor might be in that group. And so my tendency might be to say, everybody should be better. Can't we all get along?
Not all white people.
Not all white people. I mean, what is wrong with that? Because that is 99.9% of our grant applications.
Right.
Trying to get money for these not-for-profits. And you guys have been standing up for a long time saying that's just not enough. Why is that not enough?
If we don't define the problem correctly, the solutions will not avail themselves to us.
And we will,
That's the problem, right?
And we will, And then we actually will also not have the power to disrupt the folks that are incentivized to keep it in place. There's an incentive structure at play where folks are profiting and benefiting from certain systems. If we don't actually build the sort of will and political power to disrupt that, the systems will stay. And then what we will end up having is the ongoing conversations about race. Every time something happens, we need to have another conversation about race. If we don't have the ability to move people to action and move people to action in really clear ways, we will continue to sort of be in this situation where we spin our wheels.
So, I mean, it seems like to me, and I'm going to bring you back in, this.
You're all doing fine on your own. Getting in the middle of this. I just make TV shows. I have some scripts over here.
But I think the reason we get so passionate about this is because we care so much, and it's a complex problem. Mm-hmm. So on the one hand, there's two ways we could get off cheap. One is to just say it's the structure, and not hold anybody accountable. But the other way is just to blame one person, pick one corporation, to your point, Soledad, pick one person, make them the bad guy, beat them up, beat them down, then we all feel great, we still have the same problem. This idea of the complexity of the situation is something I think politics doesn't do a great job of addressing. I think art has a superpower around getting people present to the humanity of all this stuff, the humanity of the good guys and the bad guys. You know, the Black Panther, you felt more solidarity with the villain in that movie than you did for the hero half the time. Talk to us about the need for art to inform all these discussions.
Well, you know, it's hard for me to be objective, but I think it's absolutely critical. And I think it's critical for the audience. I think it's critical also for those of us who have the opportunity to tell stories and be more sensitive to the fact that we need to change the way those stories are created. Somebody talked about the writers' rooms. You were talking about the writers' room. And the reality is, even in 2019, yes, you go in a writer's room, the majority of the rooms are still going to be straight white males. I mean, it's just
66%.
I would say, I know statistically that's where it is. I would say it's much higher than that. Here's the thing, and just touching a little bit on very delicately touching on the conversations about, you know, the system versus the villain. And I'll just say where I believe and how it's related to art is that I'm sort of the Angela Davis mind. You know, you can't change the system until you destroy it. You have to destroy it because it's corrupt. All of them are. And I do think we have to change it because I also don't want to find out 25 years from now that I'm in that system and I'm just replicating what was wrong with it towards someone else. And you know, where I'm at Disney right now, and whatever I say, I'm going to sound like a shill. I know I am. But the reality is that it is a space, at least in my circumstances, and I know my circumstances aren't equivalent to everyone's circumstances, that they are very dialed into the stories that they're telling and being very specific about who's in them, who's telling them, who's writing them, who's producing them. But even at that, there are things in that system. When you get a show on the air, they literally give you this big binder full of directors. These are people that we work with. They're terrific. Pick anybody out of here, and it's great. And you go through that binder, and it's all white men.
Wow.
And they don't do that because they don't want anybody else directing, but these are the folks we know. These are the folks we feel, every episode of television, you know, maybe starts at $3 million, goes up to $4, $5, $6, $10 million. So you do a series at $100 million. You're entrusting a lot of money to people, and of course, they're going to go, hey, this person, they've been on a set. They know what they're doing. They're going to be able to take care of our money. And I'm not saying this to self-aggrandize. I'm talking about what we did. I worked with our producing partner, Michael McDonald. We went back to ABC. We said, we're not taking any of these folks. All the directors we're taking, they have to be women or people of color, or women or a person of color who's never directed a television series before. One person every year. And we did that for 3 years. And 90% of our directors, women, people of color, or someone who's not directed before. All of our producers were women or people of color, everybody in critical decision-making positions. And those people, long after I'm cold and dead in the ground, are still going to be working and changing the system. So please, I'm not, if you're applauding anybody, applaud ABC, because they came back and they said, if that's what you want to do, you just have to guarantee every episode. But that was the deal, and we did it. And we had people, Rachel Morrison, who is great, but she was the DP on Black Panther. She's already on her way. Nicole Cassell, who's doing Watchmen at HBO. Vic Mahoney, who's now doing second unit on Star Wars. They all started on this show. They had talent. They were going to break. It wasn't like, oh, we found people who were talented. They were talented. We identified them. It was good for us. It was good for ABC. It was good for the show. More importantly, it's good for storytelling. So to your point, art changes. It changes what people feel, but we got to change what's behind it. And I'm of the agreement. You can take out people, but you see how, you know, there's always somebody else. You know, you can always, oh, if I had a time machine and went back in time and I took out so-and-so, the world would be a better place. I would say no. because that system would have been in place. Blow up the system, that person can show up, they can wave their hands and gesticulate, nothing's gonna, they get no traction. You know, we should have blown up the system back in 2008 when it started with birther, when it started with this and that. You know, we should have blown it up in 93 with Anita Hill. 93, am I correct?
94.
Right, we should have, 94, my apologies, but we should have blown that up. We didn't. So when people go, oh my God, I can't believe this is happening. Really? Really? Have you not picked up a history book at all?
No.
You know?
Anita Hill, 92. So, 91. So I
was in the 90s.
How much, hold on a second. Yeah, 91. How much time do I have? Because I don't. Okay, good. I can do one more question from me? Okay. So, look, Heather, because you are such a public person, and everything that you do, I mean, when you know, we had the situation with voting, where you had the white people over here, and they were talking about, you know, we need like corporate money out of the thing. And you had the black people over here saying, we would like to be able to vote, right? And you found a way to get those people to come. We're talking about the right to vote in different ways. This conversation that we're trying to have is so hard to keep it, have the integrity at the center, concerned about the people who have been left out, and at the same time grow it so we have more people involved and more power to get something done. And I just think, you know, it would be great. You have just been a master of this particular approach. And it came through when you dealt with Gary. It comes through when you deal with senators. It comes through on the air. What is going on in your mind and your heart that lets you have so much commitment to the people at the bottom and yet still be able to keep growing this coalition?
Well, Van, that's very kind. Thank you. You know, when I said before that this country was founded on a belief in a hierarchy of human value, that to me is what guides me every day, is that core belief. It invented the theft of land and the genocide and the kidnapping of people and the chattel slavery. All of that was possible because of this belief that some people are simply better than others. That's the core belief. How is that still existing today? I mean, when you have someone who works at Walmart and makes $7.50 an hour, and then their coworker at that same corporation makes $10,000 an hour, that is expressing this hierarchy of human value, particularly when that low wage is not enough to have a dignified life for your family. I don't think if we hadn't started this country in that way, saying that your life has no value except as profit to me, we would be in the economic situation that we are today. And so what do we do about that? And this is not just a how do you design policy to fix that, but also how do you build a movement to fix that? And what are the values you need to bring to that movement? And that is why I think we're able, myself and many others, to be so inviting, is that I believe everyone has value, even the people who are responsible and who profit.
Yes.
Wow.
I want them held accountable, but I believe that they have the exact same, no more, no less, value as those that I'm trying to lift up. And so people feel that, they sense that. And that, I think, is a vision that is so different from the sort of core message of our commercialism, of the way that everything is a better model or a worse model. Every neighborhood is better, every school is better. There is this hierarchy that is everywhere in all that we say in America. And yet, we have those core values that we are still trying to live up to, but that everyone has recited at some point, everyone has believed at some point should be the aspiration, that we are all created equal. I think that's the fight, and I think we need to both make policy to make people have an equal opportunity and an equal station in life, but also bring that value of that humanity and that love of all humankind into the work that we do.
Heather, Soledad, Ridley, Rashad.
Thank you, Van.
Hey, Dan. Hey there, guys. Not a question, but more of a statement.
Steve Stout.
Yeah, Steve Stout. I'm sorry. Yeah, they heard me earlier when I was up there. Very good. Hi, Soledad.
Hey.
Haven't seen you in a while.
Nice
So I just want to say, I used to have, well, I do have This is in regard back to the narrative and the narrative change. So you guys come, both Soledad and Van, worked at CNN. And I used to have these dinner parties at my house, and it was more about conversation, and Soledad came to a few of them. And coming from advertising, this was so astonishing to me. It was executive producers of some of the sort of nationally syndicated news programs at my house. And one of them said, you know, that we get higher ratings than the talk shows, than Jimmy Kimmel or the talk shows that follow us, but they get higher advertising revenue, but on a local level, we get higher ratings. And I sat there and I said, you guys get ratings? And it dawned on me, like, that's right. You guys get ratings. So it led to the next question. I said, so if you get ratings, how do you program the news? And I sat there and I looked at everyone's face. And this is the first time I thought of this. Gail King was there, and she looked at me in astonishment. I was about to ask this question. And the guy looked and said, well, one of them said, well, what do you think? I said, well, I don't know. Terrorism? Is that what you program first if you got to get ratings? Nope, think again. I said, what could you possibly program to get ratings? He said, you know what we look for? Missing white girls. Yep. Missing white girls is the gift that keeps on giving to ratings.
Correct.
So when you talk about the narrative change, and Soledad wants to cover poverty, and someone says, no. Who wants to see that? It's a business.
But what the idea is based on is incorrect. It's because there are people who believe, and listen, who's the guy, Oscar Pistorius, right? We took his pre-trial live on my show, and we wallpapered it with his very adorable white girlfriend. And when I said, I think we should cut away, and they said, do not stop rolling pictures of the girl. That's a quote, right? Because, I mean, it was, I think, in South Africa or something, right? It was like some random trial. Why are we covering Oscar Pistorius' pre-trial? Here's why. Because she was hot. And she was hot, and that made everybody feel like, wow, this is an extra tragedy because she was so young and attractive, right? And there are minute by minutes, by the way. So they know exactly every minute where you lose the audience. It's literally called the minute by minutes, and you follow how well it does until, oh crap, we lost it there. What were we on? And you can cross-reference that to what story you cut away with. And then you can say, oh, well, this doesn't sell. But the problem is that formula is wrong. The people who've come up with it are wrong. It is just not true. When we did Black in America, people literally said to me, so don't put too many black people. Don't make it too black. And I had been in TV news long enough. I was like, I will not make this too black, even though it's called Black in America. Right? Yep, I'm on it. But at the end of the day, that series had lots of white, what they were saying, right, was do not, for God's sake, drive away the white people who make up CNN's audience, right? Do not make it uncomfortable. And we know this happens in sporting arenas too, right? Like, what's that tipping point where people feel like it's a black event versus a white event? Everybody matches it. But that show did great among African Americans, grew that audience, and even better among white people. When we did Latino in America, did great among Latinos. CNN had a tiny Latino audience, huge numbers among black people. So I think the philosophy is just wrong, and no one ever tells them it's wrong, and the only way to prove it is to win. The show that we do now, our syndicated show, which is overwhelmingly minority, unabashedly minority, and diverse show, literally we kill everything else that is, everything on cable, and we're starting to beat the CBS. We have 5 employees. CBS the second hour. I mean, it literally, and we're very overt, and they were afraid. If you say diversity, doesn't that scare people? It really does not. It doesn't have to. So I think it's just a false premise to begin with.
Very, very good. Are we done?
You're done.
Okay. Good.
Thank you.